Welcome back. This week, let's talk a little bit about the gut formation and how that impacts us, particularly in childhood and then later as we become adults, in the world of food allergies. So, like many of us, a few decades ago, it was not something that was so commonplace, right? Most people were not allergic to so many things, and that has obviously started to increase significantly in almost every classroom nowadays. It seems like there's at least one or two children who has a pretty severe food allergy. But let's talk a little bit about why that might be happening. So after birth, it takes about 18 months for the gut to form or develop a little bit more fully. But in those 18 months, right, we're going from breast milk or formula and or both to transitioning to solids to eating more foods independently. And in those 18 months, there's a lot of different things that are being introduced to the gut and to the body during that time that we might not be so cognizant of. So let's step back a little bit and let's talk about what happens during the prenatal journey in mom's body, impacting the baby's development. So a lot of times what we have is actually food sensitivities, but there's a difference between sensitivities and allergies because an allergy will be typically a little bit more serious, but it'll be more immediate. And a food sensitivity can take up to 72 hours for it to show up in our bodies. So the challenge with that is that we tend to eat the same 10 to 14 foods on average, like on a fairly rotating basis, but we tend to get exposure to those same 10 to 14 foods, maybe in slightly different preparations or combinations. What happens with the sensitivity is that every time we're exposed to that food or that trigger, our body releases a little bit of inflammation in response to that, right? Because it may not recognize what you're eating, or it may essentially perceive it as a foreign body, and so then it creates a little bit of inflammation in order to attack that and break that down. But because we may not feel that low level of inflammation being released, we tend to eat it again, or maybe if not within the next day, perhaps within 2 days, or most commonly definitely within 3 days. And so our body's getting this continual exposure, and so it's always producing this low level of inflammation. And if we continue to do that on an ongoing basis, we don't typically go from feeling no symptoms to feeling this gradual onset, right? You might, but typically what it feels like is like I feel fine, and then suddenly it feels like, oh, I feel like I can't handle X, Y, or Z. So a lot of times during pregnancy, a lot of women will start to become a little bit averse to meat or eggs or some of the more common sources of protein, or they might even start to avoid lentils or legumes or things like that for their protein sources because it starts to not feel so great in their bodies. So we naturally start to avoid it. I have a whole video about talking about what we crave, what we can't digest, but we also avoid what we can't digest, which there's a whole other video about that. But when we get into the world of pregnancy, right? We think about the foods that we're eating, the foods that we may be avoiding. So if you can feel like this just doesn't sit right, or I don't really want this, that might be okay. But if it's like a general category of foods, like if it's generally protein that's feeling harder to digest, or if it's generally fats, usually we tend to go towards the refined carbs, right? Like the crackers or the sweets and things like that, that seems to sit better. But if we're creating this low level of inflammation from the get go, then as the baby is developing, that creates an inflamed state of environment. And so when the child is born, then we also want to look at how the digestion is going, not only for the baby, but also for the mom. Because if you're planning to breastfeed your child, or if you are breastfeeding your child, the focus is often on at the pediatrician's visits, it's on how frequently the baby's having a bowel movement. And I know digestion is not really a topic that a lot of people talk about, but as parents, you probably have talked about it a lot, or very familiar with your newborn's pooping levels and history and all of that. But it's also important to look at that as your child is starting to get older, because when we are eating as a child who's eating pretty much a solid, so if they're not no longer breastfeeding or not really getting a lot of quantity through breastfeeding or formula, but as they're starting to transition to just eating solids, what we really want to make sure is that, even for adults, that for every meal that you eat, that there's actually nutrients that are getting absorbed and waste that's getting eliminated. So that means for every meal that you eat, there should actually be a bowel movement that goes along with that, which is actually a lot more frequent than most people experience, right? When I talk about that with my practice members, they're often very surprised. Like most people feel like, oh, if I have one bowel movement today, that's great. And that's a really, really great place to start. But if you can have two bowel movements a day or three bowel movements a day, depending on how many meals you're eating, that would be super, super ideal for your digestion. So, looking at how your child is digesting their food, what the quality of their bowel movements are like as a newborn, even if they're not necessarily having multiple bowel movements. I'm not saying that they should have a bowel movement for every feed that they have, but looking at the quality or the ease in their bodies when it comes to them having a bowel movement. Do they get really irritable? Do they grunt a lot? Are they straining, right? Does that seem like they're uncomfortable when having a bowel movement? Because it should actually be really easy to go, easy to clean. I should probably put a disclaimer on this video that this is what we're going to be talking about in case this feels like an awkward topic for you. But it's really, really important to look at digestion, because as your child is starting to eat solids, even if it feels like it's not an allergy, hopefully it's not an allergy, but looking at what are the sensitivities, because when our body starts to produce low levels of inflammation on an ongoing basis, the threshold for what it can continue to adapt and compensate for becomes less, right? Because it's always responding to what we're getting exposed to on a frequent basis. And then you throw in something like nuts or dairy or whatever it might be, and the body says, I can't take it anymore, I've reached my limit. And so then we get even more symptoms, right? So for me, for many years, I thought I was allergic to animals, right? I thought pet dander was my trigger. If I went into a house, especially if they had indoor cats, within half an hour or so I would get start getting congested and having a little bit of a runny nose. And it wasn't until years later, when I started getting into the world of functional nutrition, that I started understanding that if I could reduce the levels of inflammation on a ongoing basis, then my body had enough bandwidth to actually handle these intermittent stresses of when I was around different animals. So the takeaway is, if you can start paying attention to not only your child's digestion, ideally also your digestion, and talking about how to reduce the inflammatory load on your bodies. We actually run a test in our practice for our practice members to help identify what the different food sensitivities are. Again, this is not a food allergy test, but this is a food sensitivity test, so that we can look at what is impacting your body on a sub basis, so that we can help strengthen that foundation and create a stronger foundation of health, so that the repeated triggers are not such a big deal for our bodies. So, if you'd like to learn more, please check out the link below, where we talk about how you can participate in the course and really help identify what are your food sensitivities, how to improve your digestion, how to improve your health. We'll see you next time. Thanks.